There was a day in my career as a forensic doctor when no protocol or experience could prepare me for what I was about to discover. A small, seemingly insignificant object completely changed the course of an investigation that seemed like just another routine case. What was that object? And how did it manage to reveal a truth that we all overlooked? It all began with the discovery of an elderly man, found in his home in Buenos Aires, with no signs of violence or accident. A seemingly straightforward case. But something didn't add up, and that doubt led me to look beyond the obvious, because in death, as in life, appearances can be deceiving. I am Dr. Andres Salgado, forensic doctor, 45 years old, with a long career in the city morgue. Today I want to tell you the story of my most impactful case, the one that reinforced in me the importance of meticulous observation and infinite patience. But before I begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from, so I can see how far this story has reached. It was a cold winter in Buenos Aires when I received a call about the lifeless body of Don Ernesto, a 78-year-old man known by his neighbors as a calm person, with no apparent enemies. The morgue was quiet that morning, but my intuition told me this case could not be overlooked, even though everything indicated a natural death. When I arrived at the scene, the house seemed untouched. No signs of a struggle or robbery, no obvious motive for a violent death. Don Ernesto lay in his favorite chair, with a serene expression, almost at peace. But there was one detail that no one had noticed, and that was out of place. As I examined the body and surroundings, I detected something unusual, a small object on the floor beside the chair, something that didn't seem connected to the environment, something no one else had identified. That object, which at first glance would have gone unnoticed, was a key that changed everything. But what was that object? Why was it there? And above all, what was it trying to tell me? What I discovered from that point on took me down an unexpected path, where every clue became an essential piece to understand what really happened. Join me, because this story not only reveals the truth behind a case, but also the lesson I learned about how perseverance and attention to detail can change our fate when seeking justice. Death may be silent, but it never lies, and everybody has something to tell. I remember that day with a clarity I did not expect, as if every detail were etched into my mind with indelible ink. The old man's body had been found in his apartment, a small and modest space in a quiet neighborhood of Buenos Aires. When I arrived, everything seemed normal. The scene showed no signs of struggle, fall, or accident. Nothing indicated that anything extraordinary was happening, and in fact, the first thing I thought was that it was a natural death. However, something inside me, that voice one develops over the years, told me I had to look more closely. It was common that, in seemingly normal cases, small details, insignificant to most but crucial to those who know how to observe, went unnoticed. That day, while examining the area around the body, my attention was drawn to a strange object, out of place in such an orderly room as that man's. It was a small wooden box, worn by time, half hidden among some papers piled on the desk. Its appearance was not suspicious in itself, but what was remarkable was that this man, who led a simple and routine life, had never had anything like that in his surroundings before. I picked it up carefully, without disturbing anything else in its place. Upon opening it, I found something that made me stop. Inside were several old photographs, yellowed letters, and a handwritten note, which seemed to have been placed there with great care. In the note were words that not only revealed a secret hidden for years, but also implied the possibility of a hidden motive behind that death that until then had been considered natural. The letters were addressed to a person deceased had been writing to for decades, someone whose identity we did not know until then, and who could have a direct connection to what ultimately happened that night. That clue led me to break with the usual protocol. In my experience, forensic doctors have to be detectives in their own specialty. Therefore, I decided to thoroughly investigate that connection, something that was not in the official papers or the initial police reports. The time I spent analyzing the letters and comparing the dates with the episodes described in them made me understand that there was a much more complex story behind that death. It was not just a passage of time or a chronic illness that had caused it. There was something more hidden. As I progressed, the tension grew. I knew I had to be patient not to miss any detail, and not let first appearances deceive me. Sometimes, in this profession, The pressure to close the case quickly is great, but this time my intuition screamed that the end would not come without first traveling a path full of surprises. It was then that a new twist appeared. A discrepancy in the dates of the letters and certain recent bank transactions of the deceased. This opened a line of investigation into possible financial motives, even threats that no one had yet considered. Each new piece of information forced us to reconsider everything we thought we knew. The family, initially cooperative, began to become evasive. From that moment on, what seemed like a simple death from natural causes turned into an investigation involving family secrets, resentments, and perhaps a crime disguised under the appearance of fate. I had to put into practice not only my medical knowledge, but also my instinct to understand human behavior, something learned not only in university, but through years of accumulated experience. At the same time, I had to be meticulous in analyzing the body. Every detail, every stain, every small mark on the skin offered me clues about the circumstances of the death. I remember a phrase my mentor told me: "The body does not lie. It only needs someone who knows how to listen." And that was what I was trying to do. Attentively listen to that silent story the deceased was telling me through his wounds, his stiffness, every tiny mark that might seem irrelevant at first glance. Working calmly and precisely, I detected something that had gone unnoticed by everyone. A very small and hidden injury near the chest area, indicating a possible assault. It was not visible to the untrained eye, not even in a first superficial examination, but for me, it was a sign that radically changed the scenario. Something that, if detected earlier, might have directed the investigation along a different path. It took me some time to confirm that this injury had caused a mild internal hemorrhage, but enough to complicate the health condition in the hours before death. With that information, I requested complementary studies that confirmed the hypothesis. He did not die simply from natural causes. An external agent was involved. Who? Why? There lay the real question that I had to solve. And to do so, it was necessary to go beyond the body and the scene, to delve into that man's life, his relationships, and what he had carefully kept in that small wooden box on his desk. Returning again and again to letters, I noticed the handwriting change, and the messages took on an increasingly urgent, sometimes fearful tone. That made me think of a person who was being pressured or threatened, or who perhaps felt that their life was also in danger. I could not stop reflecting on how the connection between those documents and the small injury on the body could be related. The truth seemed about to emerge from the shadows. As I shared this information with the police, the case began to take on a completely different dimension. More intense interrogations were launched, and movements of people close to the deceased were reviewed, even some who seemed untouchable. With this new focus, the investigation took a dark and silent turn, with revelations no one would have imagined at first. In those moments, I felt the depth of what it means to be a forensic doctor, not only to piece together cold evidence, but also to give a voice to those who could no longer speak, to interpret silences, and to build a story based on evidence that at first seems disconnected. That experience reaffirmed to me the importance of never being guided by first impressions, and, above all, always having eyes attentive to what is out of place, because that is where the keys that can change everything are hidden. I still remember the mix of emotions I felt that afternoon, sitting in front of that old desk, holding that small box in my hands, aware that I had taken a decisive step in a case that seemed closed. It was a valuable lesson I carry with me. The truth is out there, but to find it you have to know how to look patiently and never stop asking. Because every body has something to tell, you just have to be willing to listen. And sometimes the difference lies in an object that at first glance seems insignificant, but has the power to transform an entire story. Days passed, and the investigation began to take on a less linear and more intricate form, like a web of threads crossing each other, revealing aspects that seemed incongruent with the initial appearance of the case. Revisiting the body and the surroundings had reminded me of something fundamental. No detail, however small or seemingly relevant, should be discarded. So, I decided to meticulously review every aspect of the scene, paying special attention to anything that might shed light on the deceased's relationships and possible involvement in something larger. The letters contained a message beyond their words. The tone fluctuated between nostalgia, fear, and a plea for help. The handwriting on some of them was shaky, as if the writer had suffered deep tension, a suffering that went beyond the physical. The strangest thing was that some of the dates on these letters coincided with suspicious bank transactions. Moreover, a couple of these transactions were made in the middle of the night and from terminals that did not belong to the elderly man's usual neighborhood. This raised many questions. Was he being pressured or blackmailed? Or was he himself involved in something beyond his own control? He did not have the profile of someone prone to problems, but no one is exempt from facing hidden troubles. While analyzing this information, I remembered that the small blow I found on his chest had caused a mild internal hemorrhage, enough to cause noticeable weakening. This made me think that the injury was not only recent, but possibly had preceded his death and contributed to it. However, I could not prove whether the blow had been accidental or intentional. This was, without a doubt, the turning point that led me to request the case's reopening and to insistently ask the prosecution to authorize a deeper search for clues in the deceased's surroundings. The officers in charge of the investigation began to interrogate the family more firmly, who until then had appeared calm, almost complacent. But now the atmosphere changed. The old man's children started to become evasive, contradicting themselves on some details, such as the date they last saw their father. Something in their behavior suggested they were hiding information. I requested a review of mobile phones, computers, and any documents that could be related to the man's last days. Often, the most commonly used objects are silent witnesses to secrets no one dares to confess. It was during these new reviews that a detail appeared that until then nobody had noticed: a password-protected digital folder on the computer, hidden among seemingly unimportant documents. After hours of work and some insistence, we could access its content. It was a file where the elderly man had been scanning and saving copies of some letters and old photographs, the very ones he was keeping in the wooden box. However, among those files appeared a different document, dated a few months before his death, containing a handwritten with a strange and nearly indecipherable clause at first glance. The clause mentioned an unknown person, someone who, according to will, would be entitled to a large part of the inheritance should a death occur under special circumstances. This broke the established pattern since until then, the only recognized heir family was one. The suspicion began to take concrete shape. A stranger or a hidden connection emerged as a possible motive to unravel what had happened. It was not just a matter of money, but of secrets buried in the past, ghosts that had remained silent for decades. I wondered if those letters and that small box, which apparently had meant so little to those cleaning out the apartment, were actually the key to a mystery that had been covered by the routine of the years in which silences accumulated. The investigation also led me to review visitation records. The elderly man received few visitors, according to the family, but there were a couple of entries logged by the intercom and security cameras that did not match known names. Unknown people, with disturbing profiles, who had maintained some discretion in their meetings. Naturally, these visits went unexplained and warranted special monitoring. Meanwhile, while all this was happening, I had to return once again to the body to perform some complementary tests and verify forensic details that reinforced these new hypotheses. That patient search for signs led me to find a small mark, barely noticeable near the wrist, a slight scratch that could indicate that there had possibly been some mild but significant struggle. A new clue that perfectly integrated all the pieces. The old man was not only sick or weakened by age, but someone had interfered, directly or indirectly, in his condition before dying. At the same time, the toxicological analysis yielded results that could not be overlooked. Tiny traces of medication that was not listed in any prescription or known medical history, a compound that could have further aggravated his delicate state. Soon, the story of a subtle poisoning became inevitable. This indicated that someone careful with knowledge could have tried to accelerate or cause the outcome, making the death appear natural. Increasingly, I felt I was on the brink of a decisive turning point, a revelation that would expand the case's boundaries and expose a web of hidden relationships woven around that elderly man. The family, which initially seemed the most affected and without suspicion, began to show cracks in their facade. Small disagreements, half-truths, and contradictions in their statements filled the interviews with doubts and suspicions. I was impressed by the transformation that case was undergoing, where moments before everything seemed so simple and clear. Now, however, I found myself immersed in a network of human complexities, where past resentments and old hidden debts had likely served as fuel for a fatal outcome. I thought about how life often hides invisible wounds that only death and the patient work of unraveling it can reveal. Throughout those weeks, the bond with the person who had received the letters gradually came to light. It was not a stranger, but someone with whom the old man had had a deep, almost clandestine relationship, someone who had written to him for years and to whom he responded with reservation, perhaps out of fear or social pressure. That connection was the key to understanding that peculiar, the nighttime visits and the bank transactions, where there were repressed affections, there were unfinished hopes, but also hidden resentments. Understanding that network of emotions and secrets made me rethink how forensic medicine can transcend its classic limits. It must not only interpret bodies, but also know how to interpret lives, stories, and human bonds. That is how I proceeded to leave no loose ends. Each letter, each photograph, and each sign on the body made sense within a larger story, telling a truth that seemed to have been hidden in plain sight. The days grew long, and although the certainty that something more had happened was growing, the weight of responsibility was greater. With every discovery, the need to give a voice to that man intensified, to do justice to his memory, not only from a forensic medical standpoint, but from a human one. At that moment, I understood that my work, often thankless and solitary, was not just science, but also empathy and an unrelenting search for truth. And yet, although I had many pieces in my possession, there was something that unsettled me, something that still did not quite fit, that lingering feeling, almost like a warning, telling me that what I had discovered so far was only the prelude to a story with even more surprising twists. A greater secret, perhaps, or a truth hard to accept by those close to the deceased. As I thought about all this, I recalled that object, the small wooden box, which had been the catalyst of the case. How something so humble and seemingly insignificant had turned a safe scenario into a minefield of doubts. That reflection stayed with me as a profound lesson. The true truth can hide in the smallest things, in what at first glance seems unimportant, and only patience and careful observation can reveal. Knowing how to look patiently is perhaps the greatest virtue of a forensic doctor, and that occasion showed me that such learning is vital for those who, like me, have for years sought answers in the silence of bodies, trying to understand the complexity of the lives of those who depart and those who remain seeking answers. Even today, when I think about that case, I feel a mixture of satisfaction and discomfort that discovering hidden truths brings. Because behind every death there is a universe of stories that deserve to be heard, and often a small forgotten or out-of-place object has the power to change everything. That small box was much more than that. It was a door to a complex human story, a lesson on the value of observation and commitment to truth. And although this is only the beginning of what I discovered in that case, one thing is clear. To find the truth, one must be willing to look beyond, not settle for appearances, and patiently take every step the investigation demands. Because sometimes the silence of a body speaks louder than 1,000 words, and knowing how to listen can make the difference between a closed case and a story that changes forever. Thus, with that lesson engraved, I closed that chapter, although I knew the conclusions were still to be written, and moved forward with a certainty of who I am, what my work means, and how in forensic medicine, a simple object can become the key that rewrites an entire story. That I couldn't stop thinking about the small wooden box, that insignificant box that unintentionally had become the key to opening many closed doors. When I look back, I realize that the story that began with a simple object grew in complexity, almost becoming as labyrinthine as the human mind itself. It was then that I understood how far forensic investigation could go when one does not give up on that curiosity which, although sometimes uncomfortable, is the engine that drives the search for answers. After that discovery in the protected digital folder, the prosecutor's office finally agreed to delve deeper into the elderly man's life, opening new avenues of investigation. I became increasingly involved, and I remember that during those days the tension in the air felt like a persistent murmur, a shadow beginning to take shape among those surrounding the deceased. The police told me that the contradictions in the family's account were as subtle as they were challenging. The children, under pressure, began to show erratic behavior. One avoided direct eye contact, another stammered trying to justify delays, and the youngest daughter had withdrawn into a silence that seemed too calculated to be mere sadness. There was something beneath that calm surface, a tension hovering among them that was starting to exceed natural bounds. More than once, I noticed how they tried to exchange looks filled with unspoken reproaches, mutual suspicions, perhaps even resentment stirred up by their father's death. The investigation then branched out in several directions, and one of the most unexpected emerged when, after a long and patient search through documents, an old financial relationship, hidden until then, was discovered between the elderly man and a financial institution that had lent money in his name. But what was relevant was not only those loans, but their connection to someone listed as a guarantor, a name that until that moment had not appeared anywhere, an old business partner. Someone with whom the elderly man had a strained relationship in his youth and who, according to neighbors' accounts, had disappeared years ago without a trace. This information opened a huge hole in the investigation and forced the thought that the matter was not simply a closed family problem. There was a past, a much more complex web, a story that perhaps the elderly man had wanted to protect tooth and nail until his last breath. Slowly, I began piecing together elements that seemed contradictory. Letters revealing fear, unusual financial movements, mysterious visits, and now that absent figure who seemed to emerge from the shadows. I felt I was entering almost unknown territory, where the truth appeared cautiously, and every advance raised more questions than clear answers. Not to overlook any detail, I returned to the apartment once more, intending to dig deeper into what might have been overlooked. As I checked every corner, I found beneath one of the loose floorboards a crumpled piece of paper, nearly illegible due to the wear of time. Carefully, I unfolded it, revealing an apparently innocuous item, an old invoice, but with handwritten notes that did not match any other known documentation. What was curious was a name marked in red ink that seemed familiar to me, one that matched the person mentioned in the will, that enigmatic figure whose existence had seemed a mystery until that moment. That connection led me to request an expansion of the inquiry to the city, where the supposed missing partner might have lived. There, thanks to the support of local colleagues and some field work, we found indications that the person not only existed, but had built a new identity, probably fleeing from something very serious. There were rumors of shady businesses, scams, and conflicts with dangerous groups. This raised a disturbing hypothesis. Could that old relationship have linked the elderly man's past with something darker, even today, so many years later? Meanwhile, the forensic study continued to provide subtle but crucial details. The small wound on the wrist, which had previously seemed a simple scratch, began to take on new meaning when microscopic analysis revealed traces of uncommon fibers, materials not belonging to the apartment's usual environment. It was as if that injury had occurred during an attempted defense, perhaps on an occasion when the elderly man tried to resist someone. That conclusion matched the subtle internal hemorrhage found in the chest and, together with toxic compounds detected in the blood, started to outline a more disturbing scenario, one in which the death might have been far from a natural accident. It was during a new round of family interrogations that one of the most tense moments of the case arose. That same week, the officers requested data recovery from the cell phones and revealed messages exposing that the relationship between the siblings was much tenser than it appeared. Exchanges contained words heavy with resentment, argument about inheritance control, and even veiled accusations outlining an underlying conflict. I clearly remember the eldest son's expression when he was read a message in which he referred to his father as deadweight and an obstacle to our future. There was a deep silence in the room. We all felt that phrase held far more than a simple expression of frustration. At that moment, suspicion ceased to be a vague hypothesis and became a concrete line that had to be further explored. I tried to gauge the relationship between the children and the person named in the will, and the results were surprising. Apparently, no one had much information about her, only some vague rumors and the impression that she was someone the elderly man had met many years ago, perhaps at a crucial moment in his life, but who, for unknown reasons, was neither accepted nor well regarded by the family. With the pressure mounting and the noose tightening, I allowed myself a moment to reflect on the meaning of that will and the mysterious clause. Something told me that the clause was not just a legal provision, but a kind of encrypted message, an attempt by the elderly man to protect something or someone in the shadows, a protection that perhaps could only be understood by knowing the whole story, a story that was still elusive to us. It wasn't until days later that the true scale of the labyrinth began to surface. In an unexpected turn, the police managed to locate and contact a mysterious person mentioned in the document, a woman living on the city's outskirts who, after an initial refusal and distrust, agreed to talk. What she told us struck us with the force of the unexpected. Beyond being a secret romantic link of the elderly man, that relationship held a long history of mutual protection, threats, and above all, a desperate attempt to keep certain secrets related to an old and forgotten crime safe. The woman explained that the elderly man had been an involuntary witness to a crime in his youth, something that had forced both of them to live in constant fear, taking precautions to prevent that truth from coming to light and endangering others. This explained the caution, the need to keep everything out of reach of the officially recognized family, and the complex network of visits, movements, and that no one wanted to talk about. That confession, however, was only the surface. In parallel, toxicological analyses intensified and revealed a combination of substances indicating an attempt at medical manipulation to accelerate the elderly man's health deterioration without leaving clear traces. It was the first time I clearly felt the weight of human intent behind that death, which at first glance seemed natural. The following days were marked by long hours reviewing every new lead, every testimony, until this circumstance led to the arrest of one of the children, suspected of having knowledge of and participation in these concealment maneuvers. It was neither a simple nor definitive conclusion, but the evidence was solid enough to justify that step, and for me, it was a reaffirmation of why it is essential never to settle for appearances. Throughout this process, on a personal level, I learned what the case itself taught me from the very beginning. Death is not an endpoint, but a link to all those untold stories. The small box, those worn letters, the lines in a will, a nearly invisible bruise on the skin, a message on a cell phone, the shadow of an old friend, the evasive glance of those who returned to the past. All were part of a much larger and deeper story than I had initially imagined. That is why patience was my best ally, as well as the empathy that allowed me to understand that behind every grudge or silence were real people with fears, guilt, and hopes. Because only by condensing the medical and the human can one reach true justice, one that is not measured only in sentences, but recovers the meaning of justice for those who can no longer defend themselves. That small box ultimately taught me that in forensic medicine, detail, silence, and tenacity are the most powerful tools, that a tiny object can rewrite a destiny, that there are stories hidden in trembling handwriting, in a name mentioned only once, in an almost imperceptible scratch, and above all, that behind the body lies a life with its mysteries, its intimate struggles, and its secrets, which, if one is willing to listen, can speak louder than 1,000 words. When closing that chapter, the one that kept me awake many nights and made me rethink my work, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and alertness, because although we had uncovered the hidden truth, somewhere in my mind remained the certainty that there are still similar stories, cases where justice is only reached if one has the courage to look beyond the obvious, to dig patiently, and to read every detail with precise sensitivity. If there's one valuable lesson I take from this case for anyone who might someday face the silence of a body, there are no absolute truths or total certainties, but there are small clues that, carefully and attentively assembled, can change everything. The truth is not always at the forefront. Often it hides in the tiny, the seemingly insignificant, and will only be revealed to those willing to search with a patient gaze and an attentive heart. Today, with the passage of time, I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't paid attention to that forgotten object, if I had allowed myself to be carried away by the comfort of a closed, easy, routine case. I might never have known the human network of secrets and fears that showed me how much lies behind the shroud. And it leaves me with a clear lesson. In forensic work, as in life, one must never underestimate what seems insignificant, because sometimes it is precisely through that small object that the story that changes everything is revealed. As the hours slip by slowly, immersed in a sea of documents, statements, and evidence, I felt the truth revealing itself a mixture of unsettling clarity and tenacious speculation. Every detail, no matter how small, became part of a complex web of motives and human emotions that, far from simplifying, grew increasingly dense and difficult to unravel. I had before me a puzzle with pieces that seemed to fit only if viewed from unexpected angles, and inside it, guarded, that simple object, the small wooden box, remained the silent constant that had shifted the axis of everything. One of those days, while reviewing the correspondence between the old man and the mysterious woman, I came across a letter written in a shaky but urgent hand. In it, he expressed deep fears, almost panic, at the possibility that his own children or someone close might discover his secret. The words were laden with a mixture of nostalgia and warning. They are not ready to know. They cannot touch what they do not understand. That phrase, simple yet heavy, opened a range of questions. What was it that they should not touch? What or who was in danger? And, even more disturbing, why were so many afraid of that truth? That letter seemed almost like a coded message, a last will beyond legality, a desperate voice asking for protection from beyond death. It seemed clear to me that the old man had lived under constant threat, something that possibly robbed him of peace in his final years and motivated that complicated will, that clause that at first seemed a mere formality. The need to keep those secrets at all costs was reflected in every gesture, in every twisted look from the relatives when questioned, as if each carried an invisible burden, a fear beyond the natural. I felt that this might be connected to the appearance of those toxic substances in his body, an attempt to silence him while he was still alive, though imperceptibly, slowly, stealthily. But one of the most unexpected twists came when the woman mentioned and was decided to reveal something she had not told before. In an intimate and heart-wrenching confession, she described a night when the old man had recounted a scene that would haunt her until the end, a violent encounter that was never reported, a direct threat to his life from that old business partner who had disappeared years earlier. Apparently, the troubled relationship had left very deep wounds and an invisible thread that still tied him to a dark past. Could it be that the shadow of that man, that figure who seemed to have escaped time, had returned to influence what ultimately happened to him? Everything seemed to indicate yes. No one could fully understand how deep the roots of that problem went until they delved into every moral and legal corner of his story. As the investigation extended to new charges and analyses, I was also surprised by the discovery of a diary, hidden inside the wooden box, that as I read it, each page became increasingly distressing and revealing. There, the old man recorded his deepest thoughts, fears, and descriptions of people he considered dangerous, not only for him but for those he loved. The diary recounted almost cinematic episodes, clandestine surveillance, intercepted letters, unexpected visits, and a constant feeling that someone was watching him from the shadows. That silent and dark world, unknown to almost everyone, began to become real before my eyes. The entries became increasingly harder to read, not only because of the deteriorating handwriting, but because of the tone the old man himself took on. It was clear that he had reached a point where fear and paranoia blended with certainties. But the most disturbing was the last note, written just days before his death. If something happens to me, let them know it was an accident. Let the truth be revealed, even if it breaks everything in its path. That phrase was written with all the strength of one who knows that danger is imminent and that only the truth can save him, even in death. That written confession resonated within me with an echo that went beyond the case itself. In my experience as a forensic doctor, few times had I felt that mixture of fragility and strength, of despair and resilience, in a text. It was as if, in his final hours, that man had placed all his trust in someone else being willing to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. I felt that the weight of his story illuminated for me a new responsibility, beyond medical technique, to give voice to him when he could no longer speak. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the family became unbearable. The forced meetings with lawyers and detectives exposed a web of hidden grudges that erupted in caustic words and deafening silences. The intention to gain economic benefits mixed with personal frustrations and an emotional distance that seemed impossible to bridge. What began as mere suspicion became an irreparable knot of resentments, veiled accusations, and wounds that had never healed. In that environment, any wrong word could break the fragile balance and crumble the appearance of normality. One of the most difficult points was a direct confrontation with the youngest son, who finally gave into the pressure and revealed details he had hidden until then. His account was full of contradictions, but also sincere moment of anguish and regret. He said he suspected a conspiracy to accelerate his father's illness, but didn't know what extent his older brother and she were involved. It was like a thread that, when carefully pulled, began to unravel a network of invisible betrayals, hidden pacts, and decisions made in the shadows, far from most people's knowledge. After that statement, controls over the old man's finances intensified, and their irregular bank transactions, transfers to unknown accounts, and falsified documents to hide these operations were discovered. The figure of that absent old partner began to take on an almost ghostly dimension, like a presence that, though invisible, pulled the strings from somewhere. That revelation not only challenged the family's honesty, but also hinted at a criminal web that could explain why the old man had decided to protect certain secrets so firmly. As we progressed in the investigation, I began to notice that the lines separating justice and revenge grew increasingly blurred. The tension surrounding the case affected everyone, even those of us trying to remain impartial. There were moments when fatigue seemed to take over body and soul, when questions multiplied without clear answers, and the hollowed faces of those who had once been family showed that something had broken forever. Yet it was in those moments of darkness and despair that the need to keep going surfaced, to seek every fragment of truth, no matter how small, because I knew it was the only thing that could give meaning to all that tragedy. That work reminded me, once again, that forensic medicine is not just a science of death, but the art of listening to silence, reading between the lines, understanding the nuances that escape the common eye. Because behind every body lie hidden stories, repressed emotions, and an entire universe of experiences that deserve to be uncovered so that justice can arrive, even if late. It is not just an analysis of tissues or chemicals, but a complex journey toward human truth, the kind that sometimes hurts but cannot be avoided if we truly want to fulfill our duty. And so, among statements, evidence, and endless hours in front of the screen, I became aware that the case had not only changed my career, but also the way I understand life and death. Because in that delicate balance between science and emotion, evidence and silence, the most important battle is fought. Giving voice to those who can no longer speak, and with it, offering a real chance for justice to a world that often seems only concerned with appearances. As I closed that file, while the night advanced and the silence of the apartment enveloped every corner, I realized that the small wooden box had not been just a forgotten object. It had been the key that opened not only an investigation, but a door to the deepest part of the human condition, with its fears, betrayals, and pains. In that moment, I understood that the true work of the forensic expert goes far beyond science. It is a task of empathy, patience, and courage, where every detail, no matter how insignificant it seems, can change the fate of many lives. And although that case was closed in the records and judged in the courts, inside me remained an indelible mark, the certainty that in every shadow crossing our gaze there are stories worth hearing, and that only those who accept the challenge of facing them without fear can reach the truth. Because, after all, death is not the end, but a beginning of a journey toward justice, memory, and perhaps redemption. The nights when I used to review over and over each word, each note, and every clue that could bring us closer to truth, I found myself trapped in a world where the line between reality and uncertainty blurred. Every new discovery seemed to stir the waters, shaking not only the structure of the investigation, but also the fragile calm that still remained in that broken family. The pieces of the puzzle remained disconnected, but the wooden box, with its tiny and silent weight, remained the key, the door that seemed to hide the definitive answer. Its persistent presence on my desk reminded me that the end had not yet come, that something more, still hidden, was emerging from the shadows of the case. Days later, an unexpected call generated a twist that surprised even the most skeptical investigators. The woman who had been the closest link to the old man, the one who had kept that secret so well hidden, handed us a recording, an encrypted audio message accidentally captured during one of her visits, where the old man's voice was heard with difficulty, almost whispering, but firm in his warning. If time runs out, that legacy must not fall into the wrong hands. There are those who believe it will destroy everything, but the truth is a fire that never dies. Protective, threatening, those words were a macabre mixture between a testament and a warning that opened the way to new questions. What legacy was he referring to? What was that fire he described at the end? Confusion took over the scene, and with it, a growing sense of urgency within me. With more care than ever, I decided to delve once again into the contents of the wooden box, almost reverently. Until then, I considered its documents and objects as mere fragments of a life marked by fear and suspicion, but that recording seemed to illuminate certain dark corners that had not received enough attention before. Upon opening it carefully, I noticed that, tucked between the folds of the diary, there was an old key, rusted by time but remarkably intact. It did not seem to be a key for a physical door, but rather one that opened something intangible, a symbol, or perhaps a clue that translated into certainty. Meanwhile, the family atmosphere continued to grow more oppressive. The confrontation between the siblings had reached a critical point when the eldest launched a veiled threat during a tense meeting where everyone tried to keep up appearances. He said, with a trembling but firm voice, that there were secrets some should never reveal, and that in the effort to unearth everything, we could end up unleashing demons no one was prepared to face. His warning felt like a tightrope, a dangerous balance between protecting the past and risking future destruction. The atmosphere became heavy with that uncomfortable silence that only accompanies half-truths and unconfessed ghosts. That same day, while reviewing security camera footage from the building where the old man lived, I noticed something peculiar. On the night before his death, a hooded figure was seen lurking near the window of his apartment for a long period. The most disturbing thing was not the presence itself, but the way the figure interacted with the light, almost as if searching for something or leaving a message. Although no robbery or disturbance was reported, that anonymous visit put the entire team on alert and made me wonder if the old man had not only been a victim of threats from his family or that absent partner, but if there was an external actor who had not yet been identified. One more piece that enriched yet complicated this complex board even further. A week later, a toxicology report arrived confirming what we already suspected. An uncommon substance had been detected in the old man's system, a slow-acting neurotoxic agent that could have gone unnoticed in a superficial exam. Its presence not only explained his decline and certain symptoms attributed to age, but also opened the door to the possibility of complex, measured, and nearly imperceptible murder, which caused a natural accident theory to collapse completely. Knowing this, every gesture of the family, every evasive glance, and every prolonged silence gained new meaning, a weight that increased the shadow under which all involved moved. Then, among the papers and evidence, a forgotten will appeared, drafted years before and found in an unexpected place, inside an old book in the old man's library. In that document, the man expressed not only his financial will, but also a clear and dark mandate. I demand protection for, followed by a list with blurry names, some crossed out and others barely legible, including both family members and anonymous people from his past. That demand, decontextualized yet forceful, seemed to reflect a desperate attempt to shield certain individuals and perhaps to preserve secrets that could endanger more than one person if revealed. The investigation's path forked again, toward a territory where protection blurred with fear and desperation. As I delved deeper into the lives of those mentioned, I became aware that the case was not only about a murder, but about a web of complex relationships where loyalty, guilt, and silence intertwined. I discovered that the absent partner, who seemed a ghost in the past, had maintained ties to dubious organizations and that his influence still resonated in legal and financial circles. This explained the family's caution and fear, who, even unwillingly, seemed trapped in a dangerous game they probably never wanted to take part in, but from which they could not escape. All this led me to understand that the death of that old man was only the surface of a much larger iceberg. As the investigations progressed out of the public eye, I found myself at a personal crossroads. The distance between science and humanity, which had previously been a clear and firm line, began to blur. Empathy for the victims, for the living who suffered, for souls trapped in toxic and complex relationships, made me reconsider each step, each conclusion I had to present. Sometimes, I felt that the search for truth betrayed that very truth, fragmenting it into testimonies and evidence that had more layers than concrete answers. It was a daily challenge to maintain objectivity, while my heart bore the burden of what silence hid. One night, when I already thought almost everything had been revealed, the woman guardian of the secret handed me a small sealed envelope that said, "For when you are ready." I hesitated before opening it, aware that what was inside could change not only the course of the investigation, but also my perspective on everything lived. Upon unfolding the sheet, I found a meticulously drawn map with routes, marked points, and signs that seemed to indicate places important to the old man. Alongside it, a brief but forceful message. The truth is kept where light and shadow meet. That riddle, which seemed taken from a novel, pushed us to explore both physical and symbolic spaces. It led me to visit places the old man had frequented, to reevaluate forgotten testimonies, and to listen to stories that seemed more like urban legends than real facts. But this was no game or pastime to distract from pain. It was a final part of the puzzle, the search for the exact point where the pieces made sense and the truth would emerge clear, though painful. It was in an old, deserted chapel, hidden among dim streets, that we found the answer. There, beneath a stool that had been moved thousands of times, a compartment was hidden with documents, photographs, and personal objects revealing the true extent of threat that old man had lived through. It was not just about a family cover-up or a vengeful partner, but conspiracy that crossed legal and ethical boundaries, a danger involving unexpected figures and extending beyond the inner circle. The wooden box had been only the first clue, the light that opened the door, but that solid refuge was a heart where everything took shape. As I lifted those documents and captured every detail, I knew that the story that had begun as a conventional forensic case had transformed into a lesson about human fragility, the power of fear, and the strength of hidden truth. I understood that my role was not only to interpret the physical, but to translate all that emotional and moral complexity into a path toward justice, even if slow and difficult. At that moment, that intimate journey from death to revealed truth, I felt that I had turned an important page not only in this case but in my own life. Returning to my office, with the night already well advanced and a restless calm reigning in the air, I closed the box and placed it on my desk, letting its presence remind me of what I had learned. That every object, every word, every silence holds stories with the power to change everything, and that, as a forensic expert, I must not only seek answers in death, but also honor the memory and legacy of those who can no longer tell their truths, trusting that one day, the fire they ignited will continue to light the way toward justice. Carefully placing all the documents in my briefcase, my mind was spinning, trying to grasp the weight of that revelation. We hadn't just uncovered conspiracy. We were facing a web that surpassed any expectations. However, despite the apparent calm reigning in the old chapel, there was an air of latent threat, as if that place held secrets that must remain buried forever. That unspoken command struck me hard. The truth we sought hovered on a delicate line between justice and danger. I couldn't help but wonder how many years of fear and silence it had taken for that old man to bear such a burden on his shoulders. And then I understood that my role as a forensic specialist, and now as a guardian of that legacy, went far beyond a simple investigation. The following nights were a whirlwind of discreet consultations, thorough analyses, and clandestine meetings. The people involved began to show their true faces. That family, seemingly broken inside, revealed wounds that were not only emotional but manifested in evasive attitudes, half-truths, and silences that screamed untold truths. Every conversation became a difficult dance, full of uncertainty and caution, because there was something beyond family resentment. There was fear, and that fear could be more dangerous than any tangible weapon. Talking to some of the younger ones, I detected how the old man's legacy seemed to divide them not only over the economic inheritance, but also over the responsibility each felt, consciously or unconsciously, to protect or destroy what that man tried to preserve at all costs. But the unexpected twist came on a rainy early morning when I received an anonymous envelope in my personal mailbox. It had no sender or stamp that could trace its origin. Upon opening it, I found a set of photographs and letters that spoke of a past episode in the old man's life, one that even his family seemed unaware of. They were evidence of secret meetings with a group advocating transparency in business and political circles, but who, at the same time, faced serious risks for confronting powerful interests. In those images, the old man was not the passive victim we had seen until then, but a key player in a fight he had decided to face alone. That information kept spinning endlessly in my head. If these documents were coming to light now, perhaps someone wanted the truth to emerge, or maybe to warn us that we were treading on dangerously thin ice. In the following days, I began noticing suspicious movements around me. Call it paranoia, but I had a constant feeling of being watched, of someone trying to anticipate my steps. On one such day, a particularly cold night, the device I used to record my interviews began acting strangely. The battery drained without reason, interference like radio static, and a persistent noise that reminded me of a clandestine channel static. It wasn't just a technical coincidence. Reviewing the recording, I caught a faint murmur in the background, as if someone wanted to leave a coded message or monitor my movements from afar. That's when I realized that this investigation didn't just involve me professionally, but it crossed a dangerous threshold where justice faced directly those who wanted to keep darkness intact. Aware of the matter's delicacy, I decided to reinforce my team and intensify collaboration with investigators who, although removed from the public scene, had the skills and contacts to unravel complex networks. The information I shared with them about what was discovered in the chapel and the will, as well as the toxicological substances found, was a bomb that triggered a chain of events. Simultaneously and in a coordinated way, doors that seemed closed forever began to open. Files we believed inaccessible came within our reach. Unexpected collaborators emerged from anonymity to provide vital data, and loose pieces began to move, signaling the outcome. But it was also clear that the clock was ticking against us, and any of those steps could awaken the guardians of the secret. One of the most critical moments came when, thanks to the discreet help of a retired intelligence agent, we managed to identify the hooded figure seen lurking around the old man's apartment. He wasn't a common thief nor an unknown with no motive. He was someone directly linked to groups that had pressured our now-deceased to silence him for years. His actions were tied to protecting a certain power circle that feared exposure. That revelation increased the pressure on the family, who sometimes acted out of fear, other times out of complicity. It became evident that to understand everything behind that death, we had to unravel that web of influence, capture not only the material perpetrator of the poisoning, but also those who had dictated the sentence from the shadows. Every advance brought us closer to an inevitable destiny. Constantly present at my home was a map they had entrusted to me so carefully, which I now understood was much more than mere geographical indications. It was a guide to the hidden truth in the everyday, in the seemingly insignificant. At one of those marked points, we found a small mechanical workshop forgotten by the city, an ordinary facade that hid beneath its floor vault containing documents, records, and accessories proving illicit financial activities, under-the-table payments, and manipulated contracts to the detriment of the old man and those around him. The evidence was irrefutable, and although some of it was hard to believe, it showed that the network we had imagined was only a small part, and that the case's scope exceeded ordinary human justice, touching the systemic realm. As the investigation deepened, the tension within the family reached an almost unbearable point. Tense meetings were organized, full of reproaches, accusations, and veiled threats. I couldn't help feeling like a reluctant spectator forced to mediate among a group of people torn between protecting someone and protecting themselves. The unexpected appearance of the recording, the secrets found in the chapel, and the will-revived wounds and disputes that seem buried forever. But truth has that disruptive nature. It does not settle for remaining hidden. It seeks to rise, break down structures, even if it means irreparably breaking bonds. Amid this emotional storm, I decided to visit again the woman who had been my most constant contact. Her gaze, now more tired, held the sadness of someone who knows too much and fears that the truth could bring irreparable consequences. We talked for hours, and every word she revealed was a silent pact between past and present. She told me how the old man had changed in recent years, how he had become more reserved and fearful, and how a dark shadow had settled over his life. But there were also moments of hope, for in those confidences emerged a testimony that despite everything, the old man had never stopped fighting what he called the fire of truth. And that fire, though dangerous, was the only flame capable of illuminating a path for all of us. I knew we were close to the outcome, but also that danger remained lurking. As evidence accumulated, the case took on the character of a silent warrior who had wounded many, and that perhaps was also willing to strike to protect its secrets. The question was whether we, with our limited humanity and tools, would be able to withstand that force, to bring truth to justice without falling into despair, without justice turning against us. The memory of the old man's firm, whispering voice echoed in my mind. More than a warning, it was a legacy that had to be honored. When I thought nothing more could surprise me, one last piece fell into place. In an anonymous email came a link to a video showing a clandestine meeting in a government building. In it, Figures we would never have associated with anything illegal coldly discussed the influence they wielded to manipulate not only businesses and properties, but the fate of many lives. That assertion that truth was a fire that never dies, and that there were interests wishing to extinguish it, gained new weight. It was not just a poetic phrase. It was a declaration of war against transparency and justice. This video gave us ammunition, but also the painful certainty that our steps were watched and that the battle for truth was only beginning. That night, I returned to my desk, the same table where I had paused the investigation so many times, where the wooden box rested as a visible symbol of something much larger than a simple forensic case. Truth, as painful as it was liberating, reminded me that it's never just death that must be revealed, but the lives that were marked, the silent stories, the invisible struggles. Patience, observation, empathy, those tools I seemed to find in the hardest moments, were what kept me standing, what allowed me to continue, step by step, revealing the hidden without losing humanity. And although I knew this chapter closed apart, I also understood that the flame that old man lit would endure in the search for justice. With that conviction, I turned off the light and let the night's silence envelop me as an indispensable guardian of all that had been uncovered. I knew that what had started as a routine case, a body found without apparent explanation, had transformed into a deep journey through the labyrinths of fear, loyalty, and half-truths. And in that journey beyond the limits of science and law, I learned that an object, a box, a key, and a coded message can change everything. Because, in the end, death is only the beginning of a story that deserves to be told, heard, and honored. And that story, the old man's and his legacy, was now mine too. That night, while the city seemed immersed in an almost ritual silence, I felt something inside me compress under the weight of everything we had discovered. The wooden box on my desk was not simply a container. It was the epicenter of a mystery that had yet to be fully revealed. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to organize the speed of my thoughts, because I knew the apparent calm would not last. Something in the air was moving, invisible, but with a presence that could be easily perceived. It was not paranoia. I felt it as a certainty. Someone from the shadows was watching my every move. And not only that, they were reacting. I got up from the chair and walked to the window, watching raindrops slowly slide down the fog glass. Outside, the street was almost empty except for a couple of figures that seemed to watch from a distance. It was no coincidence that at that very moment, my phone vibrated with an encrypted message. Don't stop now. The truth is closer than you think, but the cost will be high. The combination of alarm and curiosity pushed me to respond cautiously, offering only a slight hint of knowledge. I knew that thin line between justice and danger was slippery territory, and any misstep could put me in the most exposed target. The following days were marked by furtive meetings and a constant exchange of information with my most trusted allies. The alliance we had formed was neither an official nor institutional club, but a human network made of discretion, loyalty, and the shared need to uncover the web that had trapped the old man. It was during one of those meetings in a modest neighborhood cafe that I received a folder containing even more disturbing documents. Contracts signed with forged signatures, financial transactions made on the names of straw men, and correspondence linking high political circles with clandestine operations. The depth of corruption and manipulation far exceeded what I had imagined at the start. The old man had not only been a victim of poisoning, but part of a machine that, despite its size, was willing to do anything to maintain its privileges. One day, while carefully reviewing the latest evidence, I noticed a pattern in the dates and places that had gone unnoticed until then. Blood mixed with feverish secrets. A pattern revealing that many of the family's threats and movements coincided with confidential meetings in the same state, buildings shown in the video. It was as if all the pieces were moving on an invisible board, a game someone else was playing masterfully, recklessly close to us. That feeling that we were not just spectators, but also unwilling participants grew stronger. But the most disturbing moment came when, opening a digital file with passwords obtained thanks to the former intelligence agent, a name appeared that had not surfaced in any previous investigation. A high-ranking public official with enormous influence in the local administration. That revelation completely shifted the focus. It was no longer just about discovering who had poisoned the old man or what material motives existed, but about confronting a power structure operating in the shadows that could bring down pieces much bigger than us. We had to proceed with extreme caution, but urgency weighed heavily. I then felt the pressure of knowing that every piece of data I could be the key, but also the signal for an unexpected attack. It was at that moment between night and dawn that I decided to carry out a more thorough search with specialized digital forensic analysis teams. The search yielded disturbing results. Not only had communications been intercepted, but clinical and forensic records had also been manipulated to obscure the cause of death. As I processed that information, my phone rang again. It was her, the woman who had been by my side throughout the process. Her voice this time was wrapped in a mix of hopelessness and determination. She told me about a hidden file inside the chapel, a limited and guarded space where the old man kept documents that could be the key to unmasking everything. The significant part was that access was restricted, guarded by someone from the past, someone with unbreakable loyalty who considered the truth too dangerous to be released. That revelation put us on high alert, because if there was a guardian of the secret, they could be willing to do anything to maintain silence. The idea of entering that place clandestinely seemed risky, but it was the only way to bring this plot to a close. With the collaboration of a small group, we organized a silent operation in the early hours of the morning. The sound of the heavy rain covered our footsteps as we advanced toward the chapel with the right combination to open the door, giving access to files. The air was charged with a mixture of fear and adrenaline because we knew every minute could be crucial, and any mistake would put us in obvious danger. Upon entering, the dusty furniture and walls that seemed to tell ancient stories welcomed us, but what caught our attention was a small compartment hidden behind an altarpiece. Inside, we found folders with documents, handwritten letters, and photographs that confirmed the old man's fight against a relentless system. There was also a notebook with detailed notes about key meetings, witnesses that needed protection, and a list of names we had not yet known. As we reviewed that information, a subtle noise made us stop. I felt my heart race, aware that we were not alone. The guardian of the place, attentive and silent, appeared in the shadows with an expression mixing anguish and firmness. He did not want to attack, but left a clear message. There are things that cannot come to light without serious consequences. The tension was palpable, but we managed to negotiate a temporary truce with words. What I understood at that moment was that the truth was not only a noble cause, but a detonator of deep conflicts that affected not only those directly involved, but also their surroundings and past. That night, we left with a mix of relief and new considerations. The battle was just beginning, and now we had the elements to move forward with greater precision. The following days were marked by vigilance that became almost obsessive. Every movement outside my house, every phone call, seemed to be part of a larger game. Despite the fear, I decided not to back down. I was determined to reveal the truth, to bring justice to that old man who, in silence, had carried on his shoulders a legacy that now extended over me. During one of those moments of renewed tension, coded messages arrived indicating that the power circle we were facing had begun a hunt to stop us. But I also received unexpected support. A group of initially skeptical journalists started mobilizing their networks and investigating on their own, opening new doors and exposing more people involved. That shared fury to uncover the hidden strengthened us like a silent army willing to resist until the end. Between secret meetings and analysis of evidence, a shocking discovery changed the course of everything. One of the documents in the automotive workshop's vault revealed a direct connection between the old man's company and international money laundering operations. That link made clear that we were not dealing with an isolated case of local corruption, but that the network had continental ramifications, with interests surpassing any simple logic. The responsibility to keep that secret, the same that had weighed on the old man, now fell on us. In fact, the threat became even more tangible. A new attempt to sabotage my recording equipment was the last sign that the situation had turned into a covert war. None of those involved seemed capable of guaranteeing a peaceful outcome. The family, divided by fear and hope, looked around with tired eyes, seeking their fractured relationships a way to rebuild what seemed irreparable. Meanwhile, the investigation advanced, and with every step we took, it became clearer that the transition from victim to protagonist was inevitable. I who had started as a simple forensic doctor, now faced a responsibility beyond science. It was a call to understand that justice is not limited to corpses, but lives in the watchfulness of those who seek the truth, even if that means confronting demons much greater than themselves. Amid this storm, there were moments of deep reflection. I thought about that man, about his fears, about his almost absolute silence for years, and how he had found, through an object, a box, the way to leave a message for those who would come after. His mere determination to protect the truth, even at the risk of his life, was an example of courage that now pushed me to continue. I then felt that the legacy was not only mine, but belonged to all the people who believed that truth was a non-negotiable good. And although uncertainty remained constant, the certainty that we were doing something right gave me strength not to give up, despite the danger and exhaustion. I will never forget the feeling that filled the place when, in one of the last meetings with investigators and journalists, we laid all the pieces on the table: photographs, letters, documents, and the videos showing those who, dressed in power, played with the fate of entire lives. It was a moment when looks crossed with a mix of disbelief and resolve. We were achieving the impossible, giving visible form to a truth many believed buried forever. We knew the path we took was risky, almost suicidal, but we also knew the story we revealed deserved every sacrifice. Because behind every figure, every hidden signature, there were people, dreams, lives shattered by greed and impunity. As I write these words at night, I know the battle is far from over. The truth we began to uncover remains a fragile flame, threatened by powerful winds, but also a light capable of generating change if we have the courage to keep it alive. I have learned that in forensic work, as in life itself, patience and observation are not just tools but silent weapons that, used wisely, can face the darkest secrets. This case taught me that behind a body, behind a seemingly simple death, lie stories that demand to be told, that challenge fear, and can transform justice into an act of collective bravery. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson, that truth, although hidden, always seeks its way to emerge, and that we, as its custodians, must be willing to face any darkness to protect it. What followed was a time marked by an almost painful slowness. Each day brought with small advances that, far from easing the tension, thickened it like a persistent fog. The fragile balance between staying discreet and moving forward was like walking a tightrope, always keeping an eye on shadows that could fall upon us with a single and disturbing move. The weight of the information we had uncovered seemed to grow with every encounter, and that box that had been the starting point still sat there on my desk, holding secrets that had yet to fully reveal their message. One night, while reviewing the old man's notebook again, I caught a detail I had previously overlooked. A series of dates intertwined with almost cryptic references to meetings that had never wanted to appear on official calendars. It was as if that man, already knowing his life hung by an invisible thread, wanted to leave clues for those who would eventually come looking for answers without giving in to the pressure of uncertainty. It was then that I understood this was not just a case of corruption or a skillfully disguised murder, but the tip of an iceberg where morality and dignity struggled in a silent and brutal battle. I decided to share this discovery with the small circle I trusted, and everyone's reaction was a mixture of astonishment and fear. It became clear that the levels of power we were facing extended beyond what anyone could imagine, and that they were not only willing to protect themselves with secrets, but also to destroy any attempt to expose the truth. However, what stirred terror was also what kept us awake. The certainty that if we gave in, everything would be lost to oblivion, and the lives already sacrificed would not have been in vain. The days passed with an exhausting routine of constant surveillance, meetings disguised as coincidences, and an almost frantic coming and going of documents that demanded deciphering, confronting, and safeguarding. During one of these search days, an anonymous email arrived in my inbox with a warning that froze my blood. Time is running out. Remember which side you want to be on when it all explodes. Those words were an invisible clock counting down that we could not stop. But they were also a reminder that our battle was not only against the shadows of a corrupt system, but against fear itself, that emotion that paralyzes and can force us to abandon the truth for safety. It was amid this growing storm that the twist that would change the course of the investigation happened, an unexpected betrayal. One of the few collaborators I fully trusted disappeared without a trace, taking delicate information with them. The blow was hard, not only because of the material loss of evidence, but because of the wound to trust that became visible like a threatening crack within our group. That absence not only left a gap in data, but erased the last shred of certainty we thought we could maintain against an invisible yet lethal enemy. We were forced to readjust strategies, never let our guard down, and face the reality that between allies and adversaries, the line was thin and shifting. I reminded myself that behind every name in that notebook and those documents was a story I could not allow to go unheard or unjust. It was no longer just about the old man, but about all those caught in a network that seemed to grow like a dark stain spreading to unexpected places. And it was during one early morning, while reviewing photos clandestinely taken at one of the secret meetings, that I finally saw the face of a man who until then had only been a headline, a renowned businessman with direct connections to the public official we had identified, but whose involvement was much deeper and more sinister than we had assumed. Discovering that opened a dangerous door for us. Suddenly, we were not only investigating, we became both pieces and targets of that corrupt machine that didn't hesitate to use all resources to silence those who dared to challenge it. From that moment on, I began to notice unmistakable signs of more aggressive surveillance. Unknown vehicles prowled near my house. Phone calls went silent, and anonymous messages with veiled threats became a constant we could not ignore. But an unexpected figure also appeared, a former colleague from the forensic field who approached with information that shook the foundations of the investigation. He turned out to be someone who for years had worked in the shadows, uncovering serious irregularities and manipulations within the judicial system, and who now saw in our cause an opportunity to bring to light hidden truths he too had faced. With this new alliance, the investigation took a turn that led us to explore secret archives, interrogate witnesses we believed had disappeared, and unravel a web that connected not only Argentina, but also several operations in neighboring countries. For the first time, everything began to fit into a puzzle, showing the breadth and depth of corruption and latent risk. It was not just a forensic case, but a complex network of cross-complicities where economic, political, and criminal interests mixed to build an almost impregnable stronghold. But the danger was not only external. The tension began to affect the human side as well. The woman who had always been by my side during the investigation confessed in a genuine conversation that fear had started to take its toll on her. The weight of the unknown, the constant lurking threat, and the public exposure without real guarantees filled her nights with unease. It was that moment of vulnerability that brought us even closer, understanding that to face the darkness, we also had to be a light for each other. That blend of strength and fragility became an indispensable alliance to remain firm in the face of the avalanche ahead. Among those days of risk and sacrifice, we managed to take a step that seemed impossible. Coordination with independent media generated a wave of social and political pressure that began to shake structures. We were no longer a solitary team. We were a voice many started to hear. We produced an exhaustive report that, presented with irrefutable evidence, exposed a network of corruption, money laundering, and manipulation of the truth related to the old man's death. That publication was like lighting a beacon in the storm, awakening varied reactions, from desperate attempts to discredit us to shows of support and new alliances that strengthened our cause. But calm never came. Just when I thought we might breathe a little, a violent sabotage attempt on my vehicle reminded us that we were far from overcoming the risk. It was a cruel, direct warning with no margin for error. Do not let your guard down. The feeling of being watched became a tangible and terrifying reality, but also a driving force that forced me to remain alert and determined. I then understood that this was not only a battle for justice, but a personal fight against resignation and fear. As the investigation progressed, I reflected on what I had learned along the way. I discovered that behind the apparent coldness of a silent, cold body, there was a world of stories that asked to be listened to with attention and respect. That the work of a forensic expert is not just analyzing evidence, but translating those silent signals into narratives that can change realities. And that patience becomes an indispensable virtue because the truth is not revealed in an instant, but unfolds like a complex melody, with notes that can only be perceived if you are willing to listen beyond the obvious. In that final stretch, as the country began to talk about the case, I understood that the box that started it all was more than an object. It was a symbol of the yearning for justice, the fight against oblivion, and the perseverance necessary to face great structures. I had discovered that truth is not just a destination, but a hard path that demands sacrifice and courage. And as I write these lines, with the echo of that battle still resonating in my memory, I know the old man's legacy has transcended his own death. He has left us an unbreakable lesson, that no matter how dark the path seems, the truth always finds a way to emerge, illuminating even the darkest corners. Perhaps this story has no closed ending. Maybe it continues to unfold in realms we do not know and in the hands of those who still have the challenge ahead. But what I can say with certainty is that my view of justice and life was never the same again. I learned that every death is also an untold story, and that the commitment to truth does not end with a closed case, but is a continuous act that defines who we are before the world. In that box, kept on my desk, silence remains, defying time. But behind that silence, I know hope still beats, the hope that every secret uncovered and every voice heard can change something, no matter how small it may seem. That is the battle worth fighting, and the one I am willing to keep fighting, step by step, no matter what the road holds for me. The reality we faced was darker than I had anticipated, and each step we took seemed to lead us further into a minefield. Those photos shown to me that early morning not only confirmed names or connections, but also opened doors to spaces of power where corruption and impunity were commonplace, disguised beneath layers of apparent normalcy. It was a world where appearances were as fragile as the thread holding our investigation, and where every discovery felt tense, loaded with risk, as if the very air was waiting to trap us in its snare. The following days were filled with fatigue that was not only physical, but deep and penetrating. The nights grew too long, and thoughts too varied in their silent storm. I remember one particular early morning, when the city seemed to sleep, and I was alone under the faint light of a lamp, reviewing photographs and notes, trying to find a connection we might have missed. That moment I simply called the hour of silence. At that instant, I understood that our weapons were not only documents or evidence. They were the perseverance to keep searching when it seemed impossible, and the iron will not to let fear paralyze us. Betrayal, the hardest shadow to overcome, had left us an open wound, but our structure stood firm thanks to the trust we had built with other allies who, despite the lurking terror, shared our commitment. It was as if each piece of the puzzle came to life on its own, moving through dark hallways and high-level offices, echoing muffled voices that spoke of unspeakable secrets. One of those pieces was that anonymous email, a message that seemed like an ultimatum but was actually a call to action, a warning that reminded us our mission was not just investigation but survival. That old notebook became key again, not only because of the dates or cryptic references, but because its persistent reading unfolded stories between the lines, faces of people who decided to play a game with no return. I realized that each hidden meeting mentioned was not just a point in time, but a testimony of the silent struggle of someone who wanted to leave a record of what was happening behind the official facade. And that detail led me to delve deeper into a web of encounters and calls, encrypted messages and furtive movements, where understanding what happened was not enough, but why each piece of the pain that still struck. But not everything in this battle was dark. Amid the growing tension, the figure of a colleague from forensic field appeared, a man who knew the darkest corners of the judicial system and offered us an unexpected refuge. The truth he had managed to rescue after years trying to prevent the system from burying uncomfortable evidence and voices. His arrival not only expanded the scope of the investigation, but renewed our strength. He reminded us that behind those false official truths, there were other corpses buried not only underground but under impunity and silence. That alliance led us to archives that seemed condemned to oblivion, to testimonies trapped in bureaucracy and fear, and to documents obtained with utmost caution, where patterns of corruption emerged that exceeded even our worst suspicions. It was not simply a combination of rotten interests, but a network with international ramifications, managing everything from illicit businesses to the manipulation of public policies. It was a system full of cracks that we could barely begin to understand, but that was impossible to ignore. Amid all this, there were also moments of fragile and sincere humanity. My partner, the person with whom I shared not only the commitment but the nights of uncertainty, opened up in a conversation where fear was exposed without masks. It was an act of courage because acknowledging vulnerability amid the storm was facing risk on every level. I understood that to sustain this fight, we needed not only external strength, but that intimate connection that could sustain us. Our alliance became a refuge where we could be honest, where fear was not a weakness, but a shared emotion that drove us forward. The moment we managed to break through to independent media was decisive. At first, very cautiously, bringing evidence and testimonies that slowly began to resonate beyond the small circle we operated within. When the final report was presented, with every fact verified, every connection proven, and every conspiracy unmasked, I felt a weight lift, though I knew the battle was only shifting scenes. The truth, finally visible, became a fire that responded not only from those who wanted to protect themselves, but also from those who sought justice. The reaction was a whirlwind. Virulent attacks and threats intensified, but so did voices encouraging us and inviting us to keep our guard up. One of the most heartbreaking moments came shortly after, when an attempt to sabotage my vehicle made it clear that we were now being directly targeted by those who resisted transparency. Avoiding that attack was a matter of seconds, but the message was clear. We would not abandon the fight, and they were willing to do anything to keep us silent. From that moment on, the feeling of being watched, pursued, became unbearable at times, but also one more proof that we were on the right path. Paranoia became an inseparable companion. But I did not let it define my actions. The unexpected arrival of a key informant, a man who had walked for years through those shadows and knew how to move within them, was a breath of fresh air. His testimonies added a level of detail that transformed our findings into concrete evidence. He showed me how the manipulation of the system had even occurred in autopsies and forensic analyses, places where the truth was supposed to be unquestionable. It was a blow to the heart of justice and an urgent call to redouble efforts. With him, we rediscovered that the true power of the forensic expert lies not only in what is visible, but in the integrity with which each sign, each residue, each silence is interpreted. The endless nights, the risks, the losses, and the fears intertwined with those fleeting moments of clarity and hope that push us to continue. I learned that this kind of investigation is not a solitary heroic feat. They are shared battles where unity and humanity are the only true strength to withstand the storm. Because darkness is fought best with truth, yes, but also with hope and the complicity of those who refuse to be accomplices to oblivion. Looking back, I realized that that box, that seemingly insignificant object, was not only a starting point but a living metaphor. Inside it were not only documents or evidence, but the will of a man who did not want his death to be in vain, who wanted, in his own way, to draw a map for those who would come after. Those objects and their secrets reminded us that justice is not an easy path, nor quick, nor free of danger, but that every step toward it is worth every sacrifice, every risk, every moment of doubt. Now, as the country continues to talk about that case, and new voices resound demanding transparency and an end to abuses, I know the battle goes on, and in the silence still locked in that box, I feel an unbreakable certainty beating. The truth, however hidden it may seem, always finds a way to emerge. There is always someone willing to listen, to investigate, to raise their voice. And maybe that is what matters most, beyond the final outcome. That we never give in to the temptation of silence, because in every untold story there is an echo demanding to be heard, and in every half-truth there is a call that can only be answered with courage and perseverance. My commitment did not end with that case, because I understood that the work of the forensic expert, the commitment to justice, is an endless chain, a legacy built with every story, with every body that speaks from silence, with every secret that dares to step out of the shadow to illuminate a better path. And so when I look back at that box that accompanied me through so many early mornings and threats, I know its true weight lies in what remains unsaid, in what is yet to be discovered, in the battle that will continue, even if we don't see it, even if it sometimes seems invisible. That is why, from this experience, I learned something I want to share with you, my friend, because I know this story doesn't end here, nor with these words. Truth is resilient, even when it seems impossible to reach. And those of us fortunate and responsible enough to seek it must do so with patience, courage, and the certainty that although shadows pursue us, no darkness is eternal. The search is not just about finding answers, but about keeping hope alive. Because at the end of the day, that is the true justice that matters, the one that transforms and illuminates what seemed lost forever.